Hey guys, it's Mr. Danner here, and I'm going to walk you through our next unit, or at least the first couple of lessons in our next unit. So um, just make sure if you're struggling with accessing documents and working through things like this is going to be a good help for kind of how we're going to analyze some primary sources. And I'm going to keep posting things like this for the next several lessons, but just take advantage and I'll try to make this pretty quick, but I do want to make sure that you guys know what the expectation is. So we're starting into a new unit. It's going to be about voting rights and really the struggle and the shift in different people's ability to vote in our country. And so the question for the unit, and this is what you're going to be answering at the end of the unit, is what is a vote worth? Which is kind of a loaded question because you can take this any way that you want it. You see the word worth, and a lot of time you might think the term money, which it could actually come to that. You'll see some of the documents have to do with people's ability to pay for certain things in order to be able to vote. So that's one potential, or like, what is it worth a certain amount of effort or whatever. So I want you to really think about what that question means as we go through this unit. And your thinking might change, but when we get to the end and you're answering that question, there's not a specific direction I'm going to ask you to go. It's going to be based on what you really think. So just know that. And the first question we're going to answer is, what have been the barriers to voting over time? And we're going to look at how different groups of people have been prevented from voting in our country. And so the barriers are like, what are the things that are set up that make it difficult or impossible for certain groups of people to vote? So like a barrier, that's like something that blocks you or stops you from doing something. It's like a wall, right? You're trying to walk a certain direction and you run into a wall. That's a barrier. So you get stopped from doing it. So we're going to look at what are the things that stop you from voting. And one thing that I want to make sure that you're aware of is this term suffrage. Hopefully you have some familiarity with that from previous social studies class, but that term suffrage is just the right to vote. So you hear like women's suffrage, that's just the right of women to vote. African American suffrage, the right of African Americans to vote. So that term suffrage. So what I'm going to do as we go through this, there's going to be 6 documents that you have to look through. And for every document, we're going to just be asking either what were the barriers set up for people to vote, or like who gained or lost the right to vote based on this document. So what I'm going to do is just go through the very first one, give you an example of what this could look like. You can use the stuff that I type here, and then I'll just like give you a quick overview of what the rest of the documents are. But it's going to be on you to really go through and analyze those documents for what the barriers to voting and what the groups of people who are being affected by those barriers are. So the first document goes all the way back to like the founding fathers. This was when our country was brand new and they were writing the Constitution. And one of the main things that went into our Constitution was voting, because we wanted the people, or the founding fathers wanted the people to have a voice in the government. And so there was a big debate over who should be able to vote, because some people thought it should only be if you could own property, which is it's a big deal, because if you couldn't afford to own property, that means you couldn't vote. And I always use the example of myself, is if that was the case, I wouldn't have been able to vote until I was 32 years old, because I didn't own property until I was 32. So I'm going to read through this document, and we're going to just like look at what are those barriers. So James Madison says the right of suffrage, and this is, you might want to annotate this even. So the right of suffrage, and you can just click in here if this helps to annotate. The right to vote is a fundamental article in constitutions. So it's basically like that. That's like a main thing that goes into all constitutions, because we're not the only country with a constitution. Any country that has a democratic government has a constitution, and so the idea of voting is going to be in all those constitutions. The regulation, which is basically the how it is organized, how does it happen? The regulation of it at the same time is a task of peculiar delicacy, meaning that we really need to be careful like about the decisions we make around voting. We need to make sure that we're making the right decisions and the smart decisions and the ones that are the most beneficial. Allow the right to vote exclusively to property owners. So he's saying maybe we do just give the right to vote to property owners, but then everyone else, their rights might be oppressed because the only people making the decisions in our country are the rich people who can own property. He says, but if you give it equally to everyone, extend it equally to all, and then the rights of property owners, because they value the property owners and their opinions, and so says that the rights of the property owners might be overruled by the majority of people who don't own property. So he's saying that we need to decide if there's probably going to be some place in between just giving the property owners the right to vote and giving everyone the right to vote. So let's find that what the compromise should be. And so eventually the framers decided to leave voting to the states. The times, places, and manner of holding elections for senators and representatives shall be prescribed in each state by the legislature, meaning the state government decides when and how elections take place in that state, which is why during presidential primaries, some states vote in February, others vote in June, because the state decides when that happens. But the Congress may at any time by law make or alter such regulations, which is also why the presidential election, the November election, happens at the same day for everybody, because that's deciding the actual president, not just the nominees or state government. So right here, what you want to do is who might be left out of voting? So this is just asking who might be left out. Well, obviously, according to this, people who don't own property might be left out. Because he's talking, maybe we just give it to property owners. And so then what's the barrier? Well, the barrier to voting would be money. If you can't afford property, you can't vote. Obviously, that's not the case in our country, but that was part of the discussion. So that was a major barrier, is just the ability to afford property to give yourself the right to vote, at least the potential barrier. So that's kind of what we're going to be doing with all these documents. Now, I'm just going to go through what the rest of the documents are, but just think about those things and what that can look like. And again, you can use this. Feel free to type those word for word into your document, or add or use your own opinions. So then we're going to go through, there's 5 more documents, and you're going to do the same type of thing. For this document, according to this source, who has gained the right to vote? Well, this is all about after the Civil War. It's the 15th Amendment, which essentially the debate was, should freed enslaved people be given the right to vote? And the 15th Amendment decided that. So read through that, decide who was given the right to vote based on the 15th Amendment. Next, the poll tax, and this is all about barriers that were set up in southern states to prevent people from voting. So here you go, who's left out of voting and what's the barrier based on the poll taxes. And these things were going on in our country, from the 1870s all the way until the 1950s, 1960s. Next talks about Native Americans and their fight for the right to vote. Same deal. Who's left out of voting and what were the barriers based on this document. Next is about the women's suffrage movement. And, women didn't get the right to vote until 100 years ago. Again, what's the main idea of this source and this source? So there's 2 different sources. So part 1, what's the main idea? Part 2, what's the main idea? And then finally, it's talking about age as a restriction for voting, because the voting age in our country right now is 18. Well, it didn't used to be. It was 21 for a very long time. But around the time of the Vietnam War, when 18-year-olds were being sent off to fight and to die for our country, a lot of the time against their will, the idea was, well, if we can do that, why can't we vote? And so the movement to change the voting age to 18 was very strong. And so look at this, and obviously that's what the voting age is now. So they were obviously successful. So again, who was left out of voting? What's the barrier? And I kind of talked this through, but until 1970, voters had to be over 21. How do you think the Vietnam War influenced this change? So go back to what I just said, and you can use that. And then in closing, I want you to just think about what keeps people. This is the question you're answering. This is kind of like some background right here, but the big question you're answering: what keeps people from being able to vote today? And think about some barriers, because there are lots of barriers still that keep people from being able to vote. So think about that and type that right in here. So that's what we're going through. We're going to look at a lot of the barriers and the fighting for the right to vote going forward, but this is just some background about like the history of our country and the history of voting. So there you go. As always, if you have questions or concerns, just reach out to me. I'm always here to help, and I will see everyone in our next class.